Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their weekends at shopping malls and movie theaters, she found herself at the local shooting range with her grandfather, learning the art of precision shooting. Her grandfather, a retired military veteran, had recognized her natural talent early on and decided to nurture it properly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Shooting Club as Sarah arrived for what she thought would be another routine practice session. She had been coming here for 3 years now, ever since she turned 16, and had slowly earned the respect of most of the regular shooters. However, there was still a group of older marksmen who viewed her as nothing more than a curious novelty. Sarah carried her equipment bag to her usual spot at Lane 7, methodically unpacking her custom rifle. The weapon had been a gift from her grandfather on her 18th birthday. A beautiful piece of craftsmanship that had cost him months of savings. She handled it with the reverence it deserved, checking every component with practiced precision. The range was busier than usual that Saturday morning. Word had spread about an informal competition that some of the veteran shooters had organized among themselves. Sarah had heard whispers about it but hadn't been invited to participate. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on her own training regimen. As she adjusted her rifle's scope and checked her ammunition, Sarah became aware of someone watching her. She glanced up to see Marcus Webb, a man in his mid-30s who considered himself the unofficial leader of the range's elite group. Marcus had been shooting competitively for over 15 years and had several state championship trophies to his name. He was also known for his arrogant attitude and his particular disdain for what he called weekend warriors and pretenders. Marcus approached her lane with his characteristic swagger, his expensive shooting jacket gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind him followed his usual group of admirers, men who hung on his every word and laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not. Sarah had learned to ignore their presence, but today felt different somehow. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the nearby lanes. Look who's playing with the big guns again. His comment drew snickers from his followers, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly. She continued her preparations without acknowledging him. Marcus moved closer, examining her rifle with exaggerated interest. That's quite a piece of equipment for someone so young, he continued. I hope you know how to use it properly. These aren't toys, you know. Sarah finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I'm aware of that, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the growing irritation she felt. She had dealt with Marcus's condescending attitude before, but he seemed particularly persistent today. Oh. She speaks, Marcus said with mock surprise. And here I thought you were just here to look pretty and pretend to be a real shooter. The comment caused more laughter from his group, and Sarah noticed that other shooters in nearby lanes were beginning to pay attention to the exchange. Sarah's grandfather had taught her many things about shooting, but perhaps the most important lesson was about maintaining composure under pressure. Emotional shooting is poor shooting, he always said. She took a slow breath and returned to adjusting her rifle's bipod legs. Marcus interpreted her silence as weakness and decided to press further. You know, Sarah, he said, using her name with deliberate familiarity. We're having a little competition today. Real shooters only, of course. But maybe you'd like to watch? You might learn something useful. 8. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest. She had been shooting longer than some of Marcus's followers had even owned firearms. Her scores consistently ranked in the top tier of the range's record books, and she had never once had a safety violation or accident. Yet here was Marcus, treating her like a complete novice, simply because of her age and gender. What kind of competition? She asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. She had intended to ignore him completely, but something about his attitude today was particularly grating. Marcus grinned, sensing an opportunity to further humiliate her in front of the growing audience. Oh, nothing too complicated for you to understand, he said. We're shooting at progressively difficult targets, starting at 200 yards, then 300, then 500. Real precision work. not the kind of thing beginners usually attempt. Sarah knew the distances he mentioned were challenging but well within her capabilities. She had been shooting at 500 yards successfully for over a year. However, she also knew that Marcus was trying to bait her into something that would likely end in embarrassment. "Sounds interesting," she said non-committally, returning to her preparations. Marcus wasn't satisfied with her neutral response. He wanted a reaction that would confirm his superiority in front of everyone watching. "Of course. The entry fee is $50, he added. "We wouldn't want anyone wasting our time if they're not serious about it." $50 was a significant amount for Sarah, representing nearly half of her part-time job earnings for the week. But it wasn't the money that bothered her. It was the clear message that Marcus was sending. He was pricing the competition specifically to exclude her, assuming that a teenager couldn't afford such a fee. "I see," Sarah said, continuing to work on her rifle setup. She was trying to decide whether to simply ignore Marcus and continue her practice, or to call his bluff. The decision was made for her when she heard one of Marcus's followers make a crude comment about her appearance, followed by more laughter. Sarah straightened up and turned to face Marcus directly. $50 isn't a problem," she said clearly, her voice carrying to all the nearby lanes. "But I wouldn't want to take money from people who might need it more than I do." The comment caused an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Marcus's smile faltered slightly, and she could see that her response had caught him off guard. He had expected either refusal or nervous acceptance, not this quiet confidence. "Oh, really?" Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "And what makes you think you wouldn't be the one losing money today?" Sarah looked around at the faces, watching their exchange. She recognized most of them as regular shooters who had seen her practice week after week. Some looked uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior, while others seemed eager to see how the confrontation would play out. "I suppose we'll find out," she said simply. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he realized that his intended victim was not backing down as expected. He had painted himself into a corner, and backing down now would damage his reputation among his followers. "Fine," he said. "But when you lose, I don't want to hear any excuses about equipment or conditions or beginner's luck." "There won't be any excuses," Sarah replied calmly. As Marcus walked away to set up the competition targets, Sarah returned to her rifle preparations with renewed focus. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had just committed herself to a very public test of her abilities against one of the range's most experienced shooters. Her grandfather had always told her that pressure could either crush a shooter or create a diamond. As she made her final adjustments and prepared for the challenge ahead, Sarah hoped she was about to discover which one she would become. The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity as Marcus and his followers set up the competition. Sarah used the time to continue her practice routine, but she could feel the weight of expectation building around her. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the range, and more shooters had gathered to watch than she had ever seen for an informal competition. Marcus had recruited Tom Bradley, the range safety officer, to serve as the official judge for their contest. Tom was a fair man who had always treated Sarah with respect, but she could see the concern in his eyes as he explained the rules to both competitors. "This will be a simple accuracy contest," Tom announced to the growing crowd. 3 distances: 200 yards, 300 yards, and 500 yards. 5 shots at each distance. Best combined score wins. Standard target scoring applies. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Are you sure you want to do this? There's no shame in changing your mind." Sarah appreciated Tom's concern, but she had committed herself now. "I'm sure," she said firmly. Marcus overheard the exchange and laughed. "Oh, let her try, Tom. Maybe she'll learn something about real shooting today." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you'll witness the difference between a real marksman and someone who just plays with guns for fun." The first target was set at 200 yards, a distance that Sarah had been shooting successfully for years. As the challenger, she would shoot first, which meant all the pressure would be on her to set a high standard. Marcus would have the advantage of knowing what score he needed to beat. Sarah approached the firing line with her rifle, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching her every move. She had shot in front of people before, but never with this level of scrutiny and expectation. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Control your breathing, focus on the fundamentals, and trust your training. She settled into her shooting position, adjusting her body alignment and checking her sight picture. The target seemed impossibly small through her scope, even at the relatively close distance of 200 yards. Sarah took several deep breaths, allowing her heart rate to settle and her vision to stabilize. The first shot rang out with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering the next round. She had learned not to think about where her shots landed until the string was complete, focusing instead on making each shot identical to the last. 5 shots later, she stood up and stepped back from the firing line. Tom used his spotting scope to examine the target, and Sarah could see him making notes on his scorecard. His expression was carefully neutral, giving no indication of how well or poorly she had performed. Your turn, Sarah said to Marcus, trying to keep her voice steady. Marcus approached the firing line with theatrical confidence, making a show of adjusting his expensive equipment and settling into what was clearly a well-practiced routine. His rifle was a custom-built precision instrument that probably cost more than Sarah's car, equipped with the latest in advanced optics and accessories. He fired his 5 shots with mechanical precision, each shot coming at regular intervals without any visible signs of stress or hesitation. When he finished, he stood up with a satisfied smile and nodded to his supporters in the crowd. Tom examined both targets carefully before announcing the results. At 200 yards, Sarah scored 47 out of 50 points. Marcus scored 48 out of 50 points. There was a murmur from the crowd as the narrow margin became clear. Marcus's smile widened slightly. Not bad for a beginner, he said condescendingly. But we're just getting started. The targets were moved to 300 yards, a distance where wind conditions and minor variations in ammunition performance could make a significant difference. Sarah felt a mixture of disappointment and determination as she prepared for the second stage. She had shot well, but Marcus had still managed to edge her out by a single point. As they prepared for the 300-yard stage, Sarah noticed that the wind had picked up slightly. Small flags positioned around the range showed a light but variable breeze coming from the southeast. Wind reading was one of the skills her grandfather had emphasized most strongly, and Sarah spent several minutes observing the indicators before approaching the firing line. Marcus went first this time, and Sarah watched his technique carefully. He was undeniably skilled, with smooth mechanics and obvious experience reading conditions. His shots grouped tightly in the center of the target, and he seemed completely unaffected by the pressure of the competition. When Tom announced Marcus's score of 49 out of 50 points, there were appreciative murmurs from the crowd. It was an excellent score at that distance, and Sarah knew she would need to shoot almost perfectly to stay competitive. Sarah took her position at the firing line and began her pre-shot routine. The 300-yard target looked much smaller than the 200-yard version, and she could see that the wind was creating subtle mirage effects that would make precise aiming more challenging. Her first shot felt good as it left the rifle, with a smooth trigger break and natural follow-through. She worked the bolt and prepared for her second shot, making a minor adjustment for the wind she had observed. Each shot required complete concentration, and Sarah found herself falling into the focused state that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate. When she completed her 5 shots and stood up from the firing line, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. The shots had felt consistent, and she hadn't made any obvious errors in technique or wind reading. Tom took longer to score the 300-yard targets, using his spotting scope to carefully examine each hit. Finally, he turned to address the waiting crowd. At 300 yards, Marcus scored 49 points, he announced. Sarah scored 48 points. The margin was still narrow, but Sarah now found herself trailing by 2 points total. She could hear some disappointed murmurs from parts of the crowd, and she noticed that Marcus was looking increasingly confident as they prepared for the final stage. 500 yards, Marcus announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. This is where we separate the real shooters from the pretenders. 500 yards was a significant distance for precision shooting, especially with the relatively modest equipment that Sarah was using. At that range, factors like ammunition consistency, atmospheric conditions, and minor variations in shooting technique became magnified dramatically. Sarah had shot at 500 yards before, but always under perfect conditions during practice sessions. Today, with the variable wind and the pressure of competition, it would be a true test of everything her grandfather had taught her. As they prepared the final targets, Sarah could see that Marcus was already calculating victory in his mind. A 2-point lead wasn't insurmountable, but it would require near-perfect shooting for her to overcome it. Marcus only needed to maintain his current level of performance to claim an easy victory. The crowd had grown even larger during the competition, and Sarah could see that several of the range's staff members had stopped their work to watch the conclusion. The attention was both motivating and intimidating, and she struggled to maintain the mental composure that successful shooting required. Marcus approached her as they waited for the final targets to be positioned. "You've done better than I expected," he said with false magnanimity. "But 500 yards is a different game entirely. That's where experience really counts. 5. Well, 5. 5. 5. Sarah looked at him steadily. "We'll see," she said simply. The sun had climbed higher during the competition, creating heat shimmer that would make the distant target appear to dance and waver. Combined with the continuing wind, the conditions were challenging even for experienced long-range shooters. As Sarah prepared her equipment for the final stage, she thought about all the hours she had spent at this range with her grandfather. He had taught her that shooting was as much mental as physical, and that confidence came not from arrogance, but from thorough preparation and trust in proven techniques. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this competition, but her reputation among the shooters who had gathered to watch. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to discover what she was truly capable of under pressure. The 500-yard targets looked like tiny white dots in the distance, barely visible even through the spotting scopes. Sarah spent several minutes studying the wind flags and observing the mirage patterns that were now clearly visible in the afternoon heat. Her grandfather had taught her that at this distance, reading conditions properly was often more important than shooting technique. Marcus would shoot first in this final stage, which gave him the psychological advantage of being able to put pressure on Sarah with a strong performance. He took his time setting up, adjusting his rifle's elevation turret, and making careful calculations based on the current conditions. The crowd had grown quiet as Marcus settled into position. Even his usual supporters seemed to sense that this was a serious moment, requiring concentration and respect. Sarah watched his preparation carefully, noting how he compensated for the wind and heat shimmer. Marcus's first shot echoed across the range, followed by the metallic sound of his bolt cycling. He paused longer between shots now, taking time to reassess conditions after each round. At 500 yards, even small changes in wind direction could move a bullet several inches off target. When Marcus completed his string and stood up from the firing line, his expression was unreadable. Unlike the previous stages, where he had seemed confident about his performance, he now appeared focused and slightly tense. 500 yards was a humbling distance, even for experienced shooters. Tom took considerable time examining Marcus's target through the spotting scope. At this distance, determining exact hit locations required careful scrutiny, and the difference between a good score and an excellent one often came down to fractions of an inch. Finally, Tom recorded Marcus's score, but didn't announce it immediately. "Sarah, you're up," he said simply. "Marcus's score will be announced after you shoot." This was another psychological challenge for Sarah. Not knowing what score she needed to achieve meant she would have to shoot for maximum points rather than trying to calculate the minimum required for victory. Sarah approached the firing line, knowing that this moment would define how the shooting community viewed her. A poor performance here would confirm Marcus's dismissive attitude and likely result in even less respect from the other shooters. But a strong showing could establish her as a serious competitor regardless of her age. She settled into her shooting position and began her careful preparation routine. Through her scope, the 500-yard target was barely larger than the crosshairs themselves. Sarah had to trust her equipment, her training, and her ability to read the constantly shifting conditions. Her grandfather had always emphasized the importance of consistency under pressure. "Don't try to do anything special," he would say. "Just do the same thing you've practiced 1,000 times." Sarah forced herself to slow down and follow her normal pre-shot routine, despite the pressure she felt. The first shot surprised her with its crisp trigger break and smooth recoil. Sarah worked the bolt and prepared for the second shot, making a slight adjustment based on what she had observed of the bullet's impact. At this distance, she couldn't see the actual holes in the target, but experienced shooters learned to read other signs. Each shot required complete concentration and trust in her preparation. Sarah found herself falling into the focused state that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate, where external pressures and distractions faded away, and only the fundamentals of marksmanship remained. The fourth shot felt slightly different as it left the rifle, and Sarah suspected she had pulled it slightly to the left. At 500 yards, even tiny errors in technique could result in significant misses. She made a mental note and focused on making her final shot perfect. When Sarah completed her string and stood up from the firing line, she felt a strange mixture of confidence and uncertainty. The shots had felt good overall, but at this distance it was impossible to be certain of the results without examining the target closely. The crowd waited in tense silence as Tom used his spotting scope to carefully examine Sarah's target. He took even longer than usual, checking and rechecking his observations before making final marks on his scorecard. Finally, Tom stood up and faced the gathered shooters. "Ladies and gentlemen, here are the results for the 500-yard stage." Marcus scored 46 out of 50 points. There was an appreciative murmur from the crowd. 46 points at 500 yards was a very respectable score, especially under the challenging conditions they had faced. Sarah scored 48 out of 50 points. The announcement was met with stunned silence for several seconds before excited voices erupted throughout the crowd. Sarah felt a wave of disbelief and relief wash over her as the implications became clear. "That gives us final totals of," Tom continued, raising his voice to be heard over the crowd noise. "Marcus with 143 points, and Sarah with 143 points. The competition had ended in an exact tie." Sarah looked at Marcus and saw a mixture of surprise and grudging respect on his face. He had expected to win easily, but instead found himself matched point for point by the teenager he had dismissed as a novice. "A tie," Tom announced, "requires a sudden death playoff. Single shot, 500 yards, closest to center wins." Marcus approached Sarah as they prepared for the playoff round. "I underestimated you," he said quietly, and for the first time his tone carried genuine respect rather than condescension. "You can really shoot." 1. Sarah nodded acknowledgement but remained focused on the task ahead. One shot would determine the winner. Recorded, and all the pressure and attention of the entire day came down to this single moment. Marcus shot first in the playoff, and Sarah could see through her spotting scope that his bullet had struck very close to the center of the target. It was an excellent shot that would be difficult to beat. As Sarah prepared for her final shot, she thought about her grandfather and all the lessons he had taught her. More than just shooting technique, he had taught her about perseverance, confidence, and maintaining dignity under pressure. Sarah settled into position and began her routine one final time. The target seemed impossibly small and distant, and she knew that Marcus's shot had set a very high standard. But as she aligned her sight picture and controlled her breathing, Sarah felt the same calm focus that had carried her through the entire competition. The shot broke cleanly, and Sarah knew immediately that it was a good one. She remained in position for several seconds, enjoying the peaceful moment before the chaos of scoring and celebration that would follow. Tom's examination of the final shots took nearly 10 minutes, as he used multiple spotting scopes and measurement tools to determine the exact distance of each bullet from the target center. The crowd waited in tense silence as he made his calculations. Finally, Tom stood and faced the expectant shooters. Marcus's shot measured 1.3 inches from center. Sarah's shot measured 0.9 inches from center. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Sarah was declared the winner. She felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and congratulations from shooters who had barely acknowledged her presence just hours earlier. Marcus approached her with his hand extended. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "You earned that victory. I apologize for my earlier comments. They were uncalled for." Sarah shook his hand gratefully. "Thank you. You pushed me to shoot better than I knew I could." As the crowd began to disperse and the normal activities of the range resumed, Sarah packed her equipment with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had proven to herself and others that her skills were genuine and hard-earned, not just the result of luck or favorable conditions. Tom Bradley approached her as she finished packing. "Sarah, I've been watching you shoot for 3 years, and today was something special. Have you ever considered competitive shooting? There are several junior programs that could really benefit from your talent." Sarah smiled as she considered the possibilities. "I think my grandfather would like that idea," she said. That evening, Sarah called her grandfather to tell him about the day's events. He listened quietly as she described the competition and its outcome, offering occasional words of encouragement and pride. "I'm proud of you," he said when she finished. "Not because you won, but because you handled yourself with dignity and shot to the best of your ability under pressure. That's what real marksmanship is about." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that the day had changed more than just her reputation at the shooting range. She had discovered something important about herself and her capabilities, and she knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. The next Saturday, when Sarah arrived at the range for her regular practice session, she noticed that the atmosphere was different. Instead of dismissive glances and condescending comments, she received respectful nods and genuine greetings from the other shooters. Marcus was already at the range when she arrived, and he waved her over to his lane. "Sarah, I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in joining our group for some longer-range shooting next weekend. We're planning to try some targets at 800 yards. Sarah smiled as she accepted the invitation, knowing that her grandfather would be proud to see how far she had come. The teenager who had been quietly adjusting her rifle just 1 week ago was now being welcomed as an equal among shooters she had long respected and admired. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating others, but from proving to yourself that you were capable of rising to meet any challenge with courage and skill. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way, but it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her shooting career.